Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ISEAS seminar entitled Accelerating the ASEAN Power Grid 2.0 Lessons from the LTMS-PIP. This hybrid seminar is organized by Climate Change in Southeast Asia Program, ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. And my name is Siwage Dharma Negara. I'm Senior Fellow with Regional Economic Studies Program and Co-Coordinator of Indonesia Studies Program at this institute. This afternoon, ISEAS researcher will present a newly published policy report. The title is similar with the title of today's seminar. And this report discusses the progress of the ASEAN Power Grid, or APG, an integrated regional electricity grid system, aims to promote energy security, improve access to electricity, and meet national climate targets. For this report, ISEAS researchers have conducted an interview, extensive review, and to look at the best practices, challenges, and lessons learned from the Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore power integration project. They have engaged directly with key energy and climate stakeholders to collect valuable information and data to come up with some recommendation for the development of the next generation of ASEAN Power Grid, or APG 2.0, which emphasize renewable energy and advanced technology such as subsea cable, smart grids, and energy storage systems. This experience will be crucial for the upcoming power interconnection projects such as the Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines power integration projects, and also will be critical for ASEAN countries to progress towards their long-standing vision of APG 2.0. So now let me introduce the three researchers who write the report. On my far left, Dr. Mirza Huda is lead researcher at the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at this institute. His work focuses on energy transition and climate change in Southeast Asia, the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, and cross-border electricity grids in Asia. And before joining ISEAS, Mirza worked at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE Academy, and then the Nanyang Technological University. Mirza received the 2020 and 2021 Clean Edge Asia Fellowship sponsored by the National Bureau of Asian Research and the Bureau of Energy Resources at the U.S. Department of State. He received his PhD in International Energy Cooperation from the University of Queensland. On my right, Ms. Sharon Seah is Senior Fellow and Concurrent Coordinator of the ASEAN Studies Center and the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. And before joining ISEAS, Ms. Seah spent 15 years in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Singapore and the National Environment Agency. Her research interests are in ASEAN, rule of law, and climate change. And she graduated with a Master in Public and International Law from the University of Melbourne. She is the co-editor of 50 Years of ASEAN and Singapore, published by World Scientific in 2017. And then the latest book that she co-edited is entitled The Cities and Climate Challenges in Southeast Asia Compendium, published by ISEAS Publishing in 2023. She's also the lead author of the State of Southeast Asia Survey Report and the Southeast Asia Climate Outlook Survey Report. So on my left, Ms. Jiahui, she's a research officer in the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at ISEAS. Her research interests are in climate ambition through nationally determined contribution, climate finance flows, and the methane emission and urban ecosystem services. Her article can be found in publications such as CNA, the Business Times, and Eco Business. She was a co-editor of the Cities and Climate Challenges in Southeast Asia Compendium, as well as the co-author of the annual Southeast Asia Climate Outlook Survey reports. And she holds a Bachelor of Environmental Studies from the National University of Singapore. So we have a strong team here. And before we begin, please note that this webinar applies the Chatham House rule. So please consult the speakers if you want to quote them. And the three speakers will present together for a total of 40 minutes. And after that, we will have Q&A. So if you have any question, please, for those of you who are joining virtually, you can use the Q&A box to post your question. And if there's a technical issue, you can use the chat function to alert our team. So without further ado, let me now invite Dr. Mirza to take the mic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Negara. Very good afternoon and welcome to the guests both joining us physically as well as online. I believe most people have already completed their Mentimeter questions, so it's still up on the slide if anybody wants to just quickly scan their phones and get the questions there. So Dr. Negara has very eloquently given a brief overview of our project, but I thought I would start off by describing the different phases of our research project as well as the rationale and objectives. So this project on the ASEAN Power Grid is divided into 2 years. This year we're looking at the Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore Power Integration Project and the lessons we can learn from this project for the broader APG initiative. And next year we're going to take some of the findings of this research and then apply to the broader case study of APG, particularly looking at contemporary developments such as the subsea cables and BIMP-PIP, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines Power Integration Project. And so we have two broad rationales for undertaking a project on interconnections. Firstly is the strong link between interconnections and energy transitions. So grids are a fundamental requirement for decarbonization and expansion of renewables. According to a recent study published on grids by International Energy Agency, we need to refurbish or add around 80 million kilometers of grids for nations to meet their net zero targets. And in Southeast Asia, the completion of all grids, all interconnections under the APG are fundamental for the region to meet its goal of having 23% renewable energy within its total primary energy supply by 2025. And the second kind of inspiration for doing this project is the contemporary momentum towards interconnections. So the LTMS-PIP has in many ways breathed new life into the APG initiative. So we have agreements on subsea cables between Singapore and Vietnam, Singapore and Cambodia, overland interconnections between Laos and Vietnam, and of course, most importantly, the development of new multilateral projects such as the BIMP. So this is a very important time in terms of regional interconnections, and our research is motivated to kind of take advantage of this particular momentum towards interconnection and see how we can maximize it. And in terms of objectives, we aim to address the root causes of the slow implementation of the APG, suggest some suitable policy recommendations, and also facilitate discussions among policymakers on energy transition. In terms of methodology, we refer to some of the important studies undertaken by regional organizations such as the ASEAN Center for Energy, the International Energy Agency, International Renewable Energy Agency, the World Bank, and other institutions. We also used geographic information systems. Our in-house GIS expert, Ms. Rebecca Neo, helped us develop some maps and overlay interconnections with demographic and topographic data. But the bulk of our methodology was essentially conversations with stakeholders. So we undertook fieldwork between April and September this year in Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. And we interacted with officials in utilities, regulatory bodies, ministries, as well as civil society organizations. And the objective of these conversations was essentially to really find out what the challenges of the LTMS were, what the best practices were, and what this tells us about the APG. And in September this year, we held a closed-door workshop where we presented the preliminary findings of our research to government officials, public sector stakeholders, once again from the LTMS countries and beyond. And the objective of that was to get some feedback and some recommendations on our studies. And so essentially, our methodology really focused on interaction to ensure that we have various points of data so we can triangulate our findings to ensure accuracy and representation. And the culmination of all these methodology is a policy report which is being launched today. So this essentially is a very brief overview of our outline. Today I would speak about the LTMS-PIP, its challenges and best practices. Then I will pass it over to Ms. Sharon Seah, who would speak about the key findings and the main policy recommendations of our study. And Ms. Jiahui would then talk about some of the international case studies on regional integration and what we can learn from them. So the ASEAN Power Grid was first mooted in 1999 and discussed even before that by the ASEAN ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Cooperation. And the basic overview of the project is to connect the physical infrastructure within the region, but also to integrate markets as well as build strong regional institutions. And currently, 8 out of 18 interconnections have been completed, and regional interconnection capacity is around 7,000 megawatts. And once all the interconnections are completed, capacity may increase from 21,000 to 50,000. And the APG is essentially divided into 3 geographic areas: the north, the east, and the south. And currently, interconnections are mostly at the bilateral level, but there is slow movement towards regional multilateral cooperation. So the technical feasibility of all the interconnections under the APG has been substantiated by multiple studies by ACE, such as the ASEAN Interconnection Master Plan study, both the second one and the upcoming third study. And there is also broad consensus on the benefits of this project. So the APG will increase energy security, particularly increase the stability of grids, reduce emissions, and result in savings of around $1.8 billion. And research has also facilitated multiple case studies, multiple best practices that we can look at, and multiple pathways that we can use to implement the ASEAN Power Grid. So we know that the APG is technically feasible and it has multiple benefits, and we have various pathways and best practices that we can use to implement the project. So the real research question is, why aren't we there yet? Why is it taking so long to implement the ASEAN Power Grid? What are the challenges and how do we address them? So this is the research question that our project tries to address through a case study of the LTMS. So the LTMS essentially grew out of the LTM, the Laos, Thailand, Malaysia Power Integration Project, which was implemented in 2018. And the LTM and the LTMS-PIP are the region's first multilateral electricity projects. Currently, the project entails the transfer of 100 megawatts of electricity from Laos, hydroelectricity, to Thailand through Malaysia and then into Singapore. And the current agreement is till 2024, after which there can be discussion of increasing the length of the agreement to 5 years and increasing trade to 300 megawatts. And in terms of commercial arrangement, the Electricity do Laos signed a power purchase agreement with Keppel, and EDL also signed wheeling charge agreements with Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand and Tenaga Nasional Berhad. So before we started the presentation, we asked our audience members to fill out Mentimeter questions on what they think are the main drivers of energy interconnection in ASEAN. And now we can share some of the findings to initiate discussion. So we've received quite a few interesting responses. Investment is, of course, a very big issue. Some of our research in the climate change program have highlighted the issue of climate finance. Security, so I suppose that could be national security or energy security as well. Capital, I guess that's connected to finance as well. So the demand, so one person mentioned the demand is increasing. But perhaps there could be a facilitator of energy interconnection rather than a. It's actually it is a driver of interconnection. There's increasing confidence to cooperate, and renewable energy development also pushes the greater development of interconnections in the region. Innovation, yes, technological development, and institutional structures. So I guess there is some kind of idea that there is really growing capacity in the region that's really pushing through interconnections. I think. So we're now going back to the previous screen, so we can continue with the presentation. So one of the research questions that we tried to address is what actually drove the LTMS-PIP, and consistently what was mentioned in our discussions with stakeholders was the governance mechanism. So the LTMS-PIP was essentially driven by a working group which brought together officials from utilities, regulatory bodies, and ministries to really oversee the running of the project. And under the working group, we had 4 task forces, and these task forces essentially allocated responsibility to each country. And the general perception that we received from our conversations was that this gave the countries a sense of ownership and stake, and it also was contextually relevant to the political and economic systems in ASEAN, so it didn't necessarily impinge on the independence of any of the countries in terms of their own energy resources and institutions. And it also allowed members to join at different times. So that's why Singapore could join after the LTM had already been formed. So this was a flexible structure. And the working group really facilitated hundreds of meetings between the different stakeholders in the region. The working group itself met around 17 times, but many more meetings were held to address some of the challenges of this project. The most important, or one of the most important challenges, was the differences in market structures. So Singapore has an open market, and the other countries of the region has single buyer models. So a lot of training, discussions, and meetings needed to be held under the working group to facilitate some of the gaps. And we learned that one of the ways that the market structure differences was overcome was signing specific agreements between the producer countries and the wheeling countries to reduce financial risks associated with exporting electricity to an open market. And the working group also facilitated an online communication system which ensured smooth communication between the producers and the consumers. And this certainly can be a model for other regional energy projects moving forward. And the second success factor of the LTMS was the very strong level of political commitment. So the APG has been endorsed as a mechanism for regional integration in the 43rd ASEAN Summit. So it received very high level of endorsement. And the LTMS-PIP was essentially mentioned in every ASEAN Ministers on Energy meeting joint statement from the 32nd to the 41st, so a period of 9 years. And on the sideline of the AMM meetings, the 4 energy ministers of the LTMS countries also released statements both before the completion of the project to essentially highlight the momentum. And once the project was completed, it was essentially mentioned in the joint statements as a potential blueprint for other projects in the region. And the LTMS-PIP also received mention in the meetings of state leaders in Southeast Asia. So in the recent meeting between the Prime Minister of Singapore and the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Laos, the LTMS-PIP and the APG was mentioned as a very important area of cooperation. And lastly, growing political policy and technical maturity in the region has also pushed through cooperation in projects such as the LTMS. So multiple capacity building exercises are being undertaken by organizations such as ACE with international partners. And one of the good examples that was mentioned was cooperation between Germany and Vietnam in the development of wind power and how this has perlocated to other ASEAN countries. So for example, currently Laos is collaborating with Vietnam in the monsoon wind power project. And this is actually being driven by a company based in Thailand. So the capacity building and international collaboration is really starting to yield dividends in the region. And so we often hear that political will is one of the key requirements for energy cooperation in the region. But there is not much clarity on what political will is and how we achieve it. So the LTMS-PIP experience tells us that political will essentially is a combination of various things, among which are the 3 issues that I mentioned. So a good governance structure, strong coordination, political commitment, and growing expertise all contribute towards the development of political will. And this is something we can kind of take forward when we look at the BIMP and other projects. So in terms of challenges, one of the key impediments to the LTMS-PIP is limited capacity. So capacity is currently limited to 300 megawatts. However, Singapore and Malaysia has already upgraded their interconnection to 1,000 megawatts. Malaysia and Thailand are still undertaking discussions on upgrading their infrastructure. And another issue is the lack of consensus on wheeling charges. So we found some differences in what exists in literature and what we learned from the stakeholders we had meetings with. So in some literature, the LTMS-PIP has a very structured wheeling charge methodology. but some of the people we spoke to expressed that the wheeling charge for the LTMS is not strictly based on economic considerations alone, but is also essentially, it was driven by the need to facilitate the project as soon as possible. And so some of the stakeholders feel that the wheeling charges are too high, which does not encourage trade or generation, and some feel that it's too low. So in the sense, it doesn't encourage investment. So there is some diverse perceptions on the wheeling charges. And climate change, of course, has impacted the generation of hydropower. We've seen the impact of El Nino in Vietnam. And this is also the case in Laos. Droughts and very high temperatures have decreased the capacity of hydropower dams. And in combination, human activities also impede hydropower generation. So deforestation in the areas where the reservoirs are placed reduces capacity by increasing the amount of sedimentation in the reservoirs. And while the LTMS-PIP is based on existing dams, so the dams actually were there before the project was implemented, some stakeholders feel that there is a need to address the environmental and social issues related to large hydropower dams, while others feel that these issues can be minimized given that particular standards are met. So given that there are various best practices and challenges associated with the LTMS-PIP, we were thinking about how to actually apply all these findings to the broader issue of energy trade, multilateral energy trade in ASEAN. And we found a very interesting framework developed by the IEA in their study establishing multilateral power trade in ASEAN, which lays out the minimum requirements for establishing multilateral power trade, and they've grouped each of these minimum requirements into political, technical, and institutional. So political requirements include things like political will, intergovernmental agreements. Technical requirements include things like infrastructure and wheeling charges, and institutional issues include things like regional institutions and capacity building. So we try to find out through our conversations and through our data analysis what the challenges to meeting these minimum requirements are in ASEAN. So in terms of political requirements, the LTMS-PIP working group has facilitated a very high level of coordination. But what we found in our research is there exists a very high level of mistrust in the region and resource nationalism. And there is a perception that the resources that are placed in a certain country should be used for the benefit of that country. So there is an essence of competition when it comes to meeting the net zero targets. And while these issues are well known, the conversations that we had revealed that it really is an issue of framing. So the way that regional energy projects are framed and communicated kind of exacerbate resource nationalism and political mistrust. So regional energy projects are essentially presented and communicated as a facilitator of energy security and not so much issues such as development, peace building, and other broader impacts on communities which can really build more interest towards regional energy projects beyond elite circles. And there's also a lack of continuity in energy trade policies. So HVDC interconnections can take from 6 to 10 years, and very complex grids can take 15 years even. And so they're very complex and protracted endeavors. And sudden changes in government policies and sudden changes in priorities don't encourage this sort of long investment. In terms of technical requirements, as I mentioned before, there are differing perceptions on wheeling charges. So as we move towards the BIMP, we really need to kind of identify some international standards and international practices that can, encourage transparency, encourage equal distribution of costs and benefits through the wheeling charge tool. And while the LTMS represents the issue of, outdated grid infrastructure, at the broader level, the ASEAN region needs around $200 billion of investment in grids alone by 2030. And Vietnam and Thailand have already developed frameworks on smart grids, but the real issue is where would all the investment come from? So that's a very big challenge. And according to a study by ACE, the individual grid codes at the domestic level of ASEAN countries have made important progress towards accounting for variable renewable energy. However, there are still some gaps in terms of having, some safety, security, and stability issues. But more importantly, ASEAN does not have a regional grid code, and this issue needs to be looked into as we move towards the APG. And finally, in terms of institutional requirements, the working group of LTMS has currently only a limited type of stakeholders. So most stakeholders are from the public sector. And there is an absence of stakeholders from financial institutions, which kind of reduces the financial capacity of these working groups. And while there is increasing expertise among energy professionals in ASEAN, there needs to be more work done in terms of improving knowledge building on smart grids, variable renewable energy, and innovative finance mechanisms. And lastly, the LTMS-PIP demonstrates that cooperation can occur even when the markets are different. So it essentially is a representation of a collaborative approach rather than approach of consolidation. But moving forward to encourage investment, we really need to kind of find out what some of the challenges are to market reforms. So to discuss some of the policy recommendations of these existing challenges, I would now like to invite Ms. Sharon Seah to talk about our recommendations.
Thank you, Mirza, and thank you to everyone for making your way here despite the rain. Now that he has covered the three categories of minimum requirements for establishing multilateral power trade, I will go on to the recommendations that we want to make from this policy report. So one of the first things when it comes to utilizing renewable energy resources, and one of the first questions that always come to mind is, why should renewable energy be exported when it cannot reach even our own domestic constituents? And that leads to a lot of resource nationalism concerns. And this can be an impediment towards greater cooperation. But one way to address this is to develop a targeted communication strategy to convince the domestic constituents on the benefits of interconnections. And one of the most obvious ways would be to clearly identify the positive impacts of regional interconnections on local communities. For instance, in the provision of jobs or schools, provision of better infrastructure, public infrastructure, and energy access as well. So some of these issues actually can be quite easily mitigated if the stakeholders come together to develop a targeted strategy to communicate some of these benefits. And throughout our research, we also found that because ASEAN does not have a net zero target, they don't share a net zero target in the power generation sector. Instead, every country has their own targets as communicated in the nationally determined contributions or in their long-term low-emission strategies. The absence of a target doesn't provide motivation for stakeholders to come together for collective action. So in the future, if ASEAN were to think of coming together on the power generation side to put forward a net zero target, then it may spur a greater commitment towards regional cooperation. Mirza mentioned about the continuity of regional energy interconnection plans and how some of these plans are subject to change. Like, for instance, through doing this report, I think you also would have heard that the Malaysian government decided to ban the export of renewable energy in 2021. Although this export ban did not extend to the passage of electricity generated in third countries coming to Singapore or to other third countries. But it's an example of, the changes in policies that may affect investors who might be keen, for instance, to implement, to put in longer term plans to invest in the sector. So as you know, the decision was reversed this year to help build Malaysia's renewable power generation capacity. So dependent on the government's priorities, some of these policies may be changed. But certainly consistent domestic policies is definitely a good foundation and will be reassuring to the private sector. So another recommendation we have is also to build inclusive governance mechanisms that can develop broad support from stakeholders. So for instance, Mirza mentioned that the LTMS-PIP's working group did not include financial institutions. And through our conversations with different private sector actors as well, we found that there was actually a lot of keen interest to know ahead and early of some of these plans so that they can also take part in the conversations. The next one. Sorry, it's the ASEAN projects. Yeah. The challenge that we found in the differing perceptions of wheeling charge methodologies also can be, it's actually one of the more pertinent challenges. So for instance, in some studies, we found that they seem to imply that there was a more structured way of developing the wheeling charges. For instance, on developing it based on distance of trade, or balancing charges, or using a fixed administrative charge in the formula. And through this study, we also found that some stakeholders expressed that the wheeling charges was actually not calculated on a strict formula, but more with the goal of piloting this pathfinder project as soon as possible. So when we move forward into an APG, then the calculation of wheeling charges using a more consistent formula will be important, because it would serve to inform the countries who are the wheeling countries, as well as the provider countries and the recipient countries. So some of these negotiations for wheeling charges will most likely be very complex and protracted. So our recommendation is actually to develop a common wheeling charge methodology, and to do that to promote efficiency and also to recover costs for the utilities who are involved. And it also ensure transparency and fairness and predictability. And we can adopt some of these best practices from other established power pools. On the ASEAN projects of common interest, one of the issues is that, if we can identify and prioritize some of these projects, it will, as we have already mentioned, it will definitely help in the open sharing of information, and it can be made available for different stakeholders, such as investors and regulators, to access these details. So for instance, the EU has a PCI, and it actually facilitates the acceleration of implementation of projects by putting it on an open map-based platform to let people know that there are these projects going on, who which countries are involved, which private sectors are involved in those projects, and what is the level of finance required. So in a lot of instances, while there's a lot of interest from the private sector, they are not exactly clear as to the amount of investment needed and the project that's, being discussed in detail. So some of these details, including location, implementation schedules, and the contribution, for instance, in the EU website, they actually tell you that the EU is contributing this much to a particular project. I think that's very important because it gives reassurance to other entities and stakeholders that there is commitment from the governments to do this. Yeah. And moving on. We mentioned that this Pathfinder project has actually contributed to a contemporary momentum to use other interconnections, including laying subsea cables. And but some of this discussion is still in its very nascent stage. We believe that there is a feasibility study that has already been completed, and probably the details will be released in due course. But subsea cables actually will allow the region to overcome some of our geographic challenges by interconnecting between the maritime countries. And then two of the biggest archipelagic countries, which is Indonesia and the Philippines, have very significant challenges in ensuring that they can bring equitable access to electricity to their people and also connecting with the rest of the region. So subsea cables will actually play a key role in the ASEAN region by connecting between the continental and the maritime countries. But we need to also begin to start examining the technical, infrastructural, legal, environmental, and financial implications of subsea cables, including some issues about traversing other people's waters or how it would align with the UNCLOS. Yeah, so these are the issues that really need to be carefully studied in the years to come. And of course, CBA, cost-benefit analysis, has to be done to ensure that it's actually commercially feasible to undertake such an ambitious project for subsea cables. And lastly, to consider the impacts on the local communities as well as the marine environment and impacts on geopolitics. Moving on, this one I've already mentioned that the early inclusion of financial institutions, including multilateral development banks, would be tremendously useful in the APG going forward. And this can assist, these actors can assist in implementing social and environmental safeguards. Another point to make is that a regional institution that is dedicated to driving energy integration processes could be useful for ASEAN as well. And such an institution can then oversee data sharing, ensure transparency, ensure that implementation is on time, and also look at market regulation enforcements, peaceful dispute settlements, and so on. And moving on, we also identified a challenge in terms of human resources. If we move towards an energy transition for the region, then certainly there is a need to upskill the energy workforce within the different countries in Southeast Asia to facilitate the integration of variable renewable energy into our grids, to enhance their knowledge and to capacity build the energy workforce. And actually this is also would be in line, with the country's aims to meet some of their own SDGs and ensure that their workforce keeps up with the changes. And doing so will also help to enhance the grid resilience and stability. So our recommendation is to really understand the needs of each individual country's energy workforce and undertake the training in collaboration with international partners. Another recommendation we have is to really undertake research into the long-term implications of market reforms. I think we mentioned that in the LTMS, some markets are different from other markets. For instance, Singapore is a privatized market, whereas the other countries are on single buyer models. So if we undertake certain research on the implications, and you can apply, politically and economically feasible market forms, it can send positive signals to the private sector. And I think all this can be done with the recognition that obviously in this day and age, governments cannot shoulder all of the investments into grid infrastructure. So we need to cooperate with the private sector to do that. Market reforms can also provide a framework for efficient and transparency trade and enable investments and in promoting competition. We did a pre-webinar poll on which of the following should be prioritized for regional energy integration. We have 10 recommendations, but we actually identified 5 of the most urgent, and we asked you to choose. I think if we can show the results. Okay, it's very interesting. So the top action that should be prioritized is actually to identify ASEAN projects of common interest. I think this would be a very concrete action point that perhaps ASEAN can consider to put forward so that, we can move forward the APG. There are so many different parts of interconnecting that it's not very easy to have a full picture, but if you have that, it might be easier. The second most important is to establish a regional institution. So what's really interesting is that through this project, we found ADB, for instance, is doing a pilot on market trade within Southeast Asia, and they expect to complete this study by 2026. So using the results of the ADB study can certainly help to inform how the region can embark on our own multilateral energy trade within the region. And then the third one is to adopt a common wheeling charge methodology. Okay, so interesting. Thank you very much for participating in the poll. I will just pass this on to Jiahui to talk about international best practices.
Thank you. Thanks, Sharon. So, earlier on in the recommendation section, Sharon had talked about the importance of regional institutions in driving cooperation and energy interconnectivity. So in our report, we sort of looked at an example from outside the region to see what that can sort of look like. And so the example that I'll go through today is the case of the ENSO-E. So the ENSO-E stands for the European Network of Transmission System Operators for Electricity. So there's also an ENSO-G, which oversees gas transport. So the ENSO-E is basically a regional platform which was established for coordinating the operations of Europe's interconnected electrical grid. So the duties of the ENSO-E include grid planning, like future grid planning, also looking at technical roles, IT programs, facilitating market integration, and also research and innovation projects. So it consists of and is governed by representatives from transmission operators from the EU countries. So the ENSO-E was established by the EU under the Third Energy Package from 2009. So the Third Energy Package consisted of regional rules for the European energy system. And around the same time, they also established the Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators, also known as ACER. So ACER, which is an agency that facilitates coordination among regulatory authorities, works together with ENSO-E, which consists of the transmission system operators. And ENSO-E is also subject to monitoring and recommendations from ACER on the work that it does. So ENSO-E receives its mandate from the EU. So when it was first established, it was tasked with developing common network codes and also 10-year network development plans under the EU's Third Energy Package. And so that's what it's been doing since it's been established. It also develops research roadmaps regional security coordinators, and also security of supply assessments for the region. And then more recently in 2020, the EU had another package called the Clean Energy Package. And then this one gave the NSOE some additional tasks to also look at resource adequacy assessments and risk preparedness assessments. Yeah, so that's what the work they do is in a nutshell. And it is said that the NSOE's work has helped to double cross-border electricity exchanges since it was started. And it has also allowed the region to deal with security challenges such as COVID-19 and also challenges like renewable energy integration throughout the whole of Europe's grid. So on the slide here, I have like a simple chart on how on the institutional structure of the NSOE. It has an assembly which consists of representatives from 39 TSOs from 35 European countries. And it also has a board consisting of 12 elected members, as well as a secretariat. And then it has a division of responsibilities here into these committees. So the Systems Development Committee, Systems Operations Committee, Market Committee, and also Research, Development, and Innovation. So then the NSOE is also guided by two main documents. The first one is the Articles of Association. So this is the document that lays out this operational rules and definitions. It lists out the different sub-bodies of the NSOE and their responsibilities, and then it also handles, it addresses the dispute mechanisms between TSOs, as well as financial arrangements. And then the second document is the internal regulations, which it complements these Articles of Association. So they are more like technical and practical rules that it has to follow. Yeah, so this is how like the NSOE sort of works. And I think there are some insights that can be taken from this example. So firstly, the NSOE allows the TSOs to work very closely together to develop quite detailed and concrete plans for grid development in Europe. So these are called the 10-year network development plans, and they basically sort of give an overview of the challenges and opportunities that face the European grid, and also they help identify potential projects for common interest, which Sharon mentioned earlier, which allows the EU to sort of identify what projects they can invest in the future. Another thing is that they work very closely with the regulatory bodies. So they are monitored and they receive recommendations from ASER, which I mentioned earlier. And lastly, they also have placed a lot of emphasis on transparency. So the NSOE has established a platform called the NSOE Transparency Platform, which allows anyone from the public to access electricity market data from the NSOE members. So this is actually supported by a legal mandate from the EU for the members to make their key electricity data publicly available. So that's also something that we could probably learn from. Yeah, something that we could consider. Okay, so that's the case study of the NSOE. And with that, we've sort of come to the end of our presentation, but I would just like to show the last slide. So that's our QR code where you can download the report, which is now available on our website. We also have some physical copies that are on the right side of the room, so you can take those later on. So thank you very much, and I'll hand the time back to Dr. Siwage.
I think Sharon would like to share one more slide. Okay, maybe.
Yeah, can you show the slide on the new subsea? Yeah, so why did we term our report ASEAN Power Grid 2.0? It's because we are starting to see that these new subsea cable projects that are being considered has the potential to allow the region to tap into our expansive and massive renewable energy potential to carry this electricity across the region. And in recent years, since the initiation of the LTMS-PIP, there's been new cable projects being discussed bilaterally between countries. It's not part of the APG, the original APG plan. These are new interconnections that could make its way into a second version of the APG. And some of these connections include being those between domestically between Peninsular Malaysia and Sarawak, Singapore, Sarawak, Cambodia, Sarawak, and even Vietnam and Singapore, as well as Indonesia, Singapore. And all of these interconnections have, besides it being, done bilaterally, has a potential to add to a regional integration process and aspect. Right now, what we see with the LTMS-PIP is that it's a unilateral flow of electricity from Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. When we talk about ASEAN Power Grid 2.0, the vision is that it will be a multi-directional sale and multiplayer in that entire setup involving more than 2 countries. So because the LTMS-PIP has seen some success, another sub-region, being the Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines PIP, has announced at the 43rd ASEAN Summit that they will also set up their own PIP. So the BIMP will be the second multilateral power project of the region. And they will certainly be able to take lessons from the LTMS. And of course, if you notice, then the common factor in the both PIPs is Malaysia. And Malaysia has a good deal of lessons that it has under its belt with the LTMS-PIP and could certainly be the consistent factor in the next PIP. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Sharon, Mirza, and Jiahui, for sharing with us the key findings from the report. I think you have highlighted some of the progress and challenges, and also some policy recommendation to move forward. And yeah, I think now we have some time for question and answer. I can see that there are some question posed in the Q&A box. So let me take the question from the virtual audience first. Later, I will give the floor to the audience in the seminar room. So let me take this quite technical question from Yan Yong. I think he asked, how would you manage the price differences among all countries? How should we calculate the distribution cost of the power? Is there anyone who can answer this question?
Okay, I'm definitely not an economist. The way it worked for the LTMS is very different because Singapore has a wholesale market and a retail market. So the prices are according to what the market dictates. But if we kind of do energy trade with countries that have different types of markets, then we really need to have some kind of comprehensive purchase power agreements, and some of the market reform issues that Sharon mentioned. I guess with the BIMP-PIP, the Philippines is the odd one out because it has open market compared to the other countries. So it'll be interesting to see how they actually go about setting the prices for that multilateral project. But the issue of pricing is obviously a very domestic issue. And deregulation has multiple political repercussions, given the close link between energy prices and economic development. The prices related to regional energy trade would really depend on how the individual countries look upon deregulation and opening up their markets in the future. But currently, what the LTMS-PIP shows us is some differences in markets can be overcome as long as the purchasing country has a higher higher energy price than the producing ones.
Yeah, thank you, Mirza. And the next question is on the wheeling charges. There are two questions from Mohammed Izzat Mohtaruddin. So the first question is that is this the correct understanding that wheeling charges should be based on the transmission cost in Thailand and Malaysia with a slight markup? That's the first question. And the second one, who should regulate the wheeling charges, considering that it cuts across different jurisdictions? So can you answer that? Okay.
Yeah, there's currently no regulation of wheeling charges. You will have seen that there was a commercial agreement done by EDL with Keppel. That's like your PPA. And then EDL goes on to sign wheeling charge agreements with EGAT and with TNB. So there is no central regulator of sorts. It really will then depend on the two parties agreeing. So I think the general conventional idea is that wheeling charges are based on the transmission distance. And also they have to factor in, for instance, the use of the infrastructure and recover some of this costs related to that. And then some countries, they have their own requirements. For instance, they may impose an administrative charge, and some of this charge can go towards translating into positive benefits for their own constituents. So, as I mentioned, there is no uniform methodology at this point, and therefore, if the region were to engage in multilateral power trade, then some of these issues need to be discussed, and a formula has to be generated so that it satisfies, all parties going into the agreement. And I think it is got to demonstrate that it has to be a win-win-win-win for everyone down the line. And in our conception of a multilateral power trade, win-win-win-win back up the line as well. Assuming that right now it's unidirectional, but if you make it bi-directional and multi-directional, then it has to be win-win-win for all of the ASEAN member states who want to be connected into the APG.
Thank you, Sharon. And the next question from Stephanie Muker. So, social license and community consent to things such as transmission lines being built over farming or other private land is a complex issue being faced globally. And did you identify these issues or recommendation in your study for ASEAN about this social license and community consent? Yeah, to use maybe the land or the community areas.
Yeah, I think through our conversations with stakeholders, we also talk to civil society organizations, civil society actors. Some of these concerns are also reflected, but because it's a very domestic issue, it really depends, I think, what the decision on land use is made domestically. And of course, there are competing priorities, right? When you are thinking of a piece of land that you would like to set aside, for instance, for a plantation versus having it converted to a facility that could generate electricity. I think some of these cost-benefit analysis is done internally by the country, and hopefully in consultation with the local communities and the stakeholders. Yeah, so I can't exactly answer that question. It was certainly discussed with us, and we are aware of that.
Thank you. And the next question is from Junyi Chiu. What are the fundamentals for BIMP-PIP? He said that he can understand the need for LTMS-PIP, but what are the justification for BIMP-PIP?
Thank you for the question. So the main justification for the BIMP-PIP is essentially the lower cost of electricity produced in Borneo compared to other regions. So there's an economic factor there. We've highlighted that in our report. The other justification is, of course, regional cooperation. It's a facilitator of, these countries to come together and integrate their energy and economies. So there's that political motivation and underpinned by economic imperatives.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on that, as early as 1979, actually the region's utility bodies and regulators did do a study, and we mentioned it in the report, on the economic rationale of interconnecting. So, but then the economic rationale never translated into actual projects. Instead, in 1981, the region saw its first interconnector, which was between Thailand and Malaysia. And then thereafter, countries actually had their own interconnections, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Malaysia, Thailand, Laos. Most of these interconnections in the early 80s were not meant for trade. They were more for contingency purposes to assist each other in the event of, emergencies or blackouts, and not so much for multilateral trade. Which is why one of the challenges we mentioned in the LTMS-PIP is because it's using existing interconnection and the capacity is limited to really expand on this project, then it requires an upgrade in the infrastructure. So rationales and all were already discussed very early on in the region, but never translated, which is why it was very curious that the LTMS-PIP came on board recently. Yeah.
Okay, I think there are some more questions, quite a lot of questions from the virtual participants, but let's now give the opportunity for audience in the seminar room to ask questions. Yeah, Casey, and then later.
Yeah, I want to draw from the earlier points whether do you see bilateral arrangements in the past and in the future? Does it actually slow down the achievement of APG 2.0, or does it facilitate? Because that's the point. And whether, how do you move forward if it is the later case, right? And are you considering, have you done analysis on the degree of gaps to achieve the different challenges? For example, how difficult it is to, let's say, to harmonize the grid codes versus wheeling charges versus human resources requirement and things like that. Have you gone into that detail to enable to give policy recommendation in terms of this is really serious, it takes a little bit more effort, this is not so bad, you can do it with minimal effort. And among the political, technical, institutional capacity required, you put 3 classes of challenges, right? Does political challenges, is that the main one that has to be overcome before you can do the second and the third? Thank you.
Maybe I'll start and then Mirza can add on. I think throughout this study, we found that the political trust was very high. And one of the reasons for that is because, within ASEAN, we've already enjoyed over 50 years of peace and stability in the region that has laid a foundational groundwork for the countries to be engaged at different levels, the political, the policy making, the regulatory, and even at the private sector level. So having this trust bank built up for us over the last 50 years was very helpful and certainly paved the way for such a cooperation to take place. So I would say that, compared to the other requirements, for instance, technical requirements, grid codes and so on, it could be easily done if countries agree to come together to discuss their respective codes and find ways to harmonize the code so that your grids can actually talk to each other. But when you have a political obstacle, for instance, if, countries were to say that, I do not want interference, no market reforms, I do not want to be talking about that, then it really hampers the discussions going forward. Yeah. Mirza, would you like to add on?
Thank you, Casey, for that very interesting question. So in our research, we did come across some evidence of how bilateral relationships makes multilateral projects complicated. So we found, some bilateral disputes regarding payments, bilateral disputes regarding political issues can make multilateral projects difficult, particularly when you have the issue of transit. If the consuming country is, it's a third country, and then the transit country has some kind of issue with where the energy is being produced, and this can really make multilateral projects complicated. And this is in conformity with what you see globally. In Central Asia, in South Asia, transit is always a bit of an issue, and bilateral relationships can make multilateral projects very, very difficult. I completely agree with Sharon, what she mentioned about political issues being, the most important impediment. But we've also been told that finance is a very big challenge. The amount of money we need, around 200 billion by 2030, just on grids is very daunting, given the varied levels of economic development in Southeast Asia. So there's been quite a lot of development in areas like grid codes. One of the people we spoke to even said that, these are not issues at all. And somebody actually mentioned, energy cooperation is easy peasy. As long as you can meet the political issues. So, so there are varied levels of challenges in terms of meeting the minimum requirements, but politics, finance, essentially, I dare say, takes precedence over technical issues.
Thank you, Mirza. Gentlemen? Yeah. And then.
Augustine, having visited and done the story on the Namtun 2, which is built on the tributary leading to the Mekong, my observation is that it's easier to pull off the grid in mainland Southeast Asia versus maritime Southeast Asia. I mean, I did that story 10 years ago, and finally we are talking about electricity from Laos coming down. The main challenge from my observation is politics, because of the revolving door in Thailand in politics and to some extent in Malaysia, and finally there's a bit of stability now. But I like what you said, Mirza, about it's a lot cheaper in Borneo to get. So the Sarawak Energy team did a very strong presentation at the SEW Week in Singapore, and they said you don't have to talk to Putrajaya, you can come straight to us and we can, But you go into the coffee break and the entire pitch is demolished because you have to bring the Indonesians into the picture. At the narrowest point, the undersea cable has to cross probably Indonesian waters. So if you go online, you will find lots of maps showing you can go to Batam and then swing it up to Singapore. So my point here is, I sense it's, as Sharon mentioned, the UNCLOS territorial waters a lot more complicated in maritime Southeast Asia versus mainland Southeast Asia. So my question is actually linked to that little poll that you did. I know only over 20 of us took part. It's not empirical evidence, but identifying ASEAN projects of common interest got the highest votes. But I personally think adopting a communication strategy is the area that I would recommend that the panel should look into. As a journalist, I noticed that you also brought it up. Why export when internal needs are not met? It's because they don't see the strategy of bringing prices down eventually, common market for pricing. When you have vested interest between countries, plural, lesser chance for disputes to happen because you're so interconnected, right? So I just wondering whether the panel is going to explore the communication strategy of the grid across all 10, and with Timor-Leste joining soon, maybe 11 countries as well. Yeah. Sorry, it's kind of a long preamble. Thank you.
I'll respond to some of your points if I pass it on to Sharon. So in terms of communication strategy, this was once again a result of our consultations. So some of the officials felt that, when we present a regional energy project, we should take into account the interests of different stakeholders, both within a country and between countries. But I guess in addition to communicating energy project in a certain way, we also have to develop it to meet the interests of various stakeholders, which kind of feeds into what Sharon mentioned about job creation, livelihoods, etc. There are certain international examples of winning over local communities. Some of the examples include hiring local community members to guard infrastructure. Sometimes one person I interviewed who was involved in a Central Asian project mentioned that during the excavation process for essentially putting in grid lines, some archaeological findings were found. So this was then used by the energy company to kind of promote the project itself. So you have to be a little bit innovative, and transparency and inclusion always helps.
Well, I think definitely, as I agree with you, Augustine, that the maritime connection is going to be a lot trickier, and it's also going to be a lot trickier when you are building new infrastructure and having to factor in the kind of a depreciation of those costs, right? Including into the wheeling methodology, into the wheeling charges, because assuming that you're going to lay the line across a third country's waters. In order to reach the recipient country, then some of these considerations will definitely make their way there, and it's very complex because it requires also the technical personnel and the considerations coming in to see whether all of this makes sense. And ultimately, right, the companies that are doing this have to see that it makes commercial sense, and the consumers on the receiving end must be willing to pay for the electricity that's being brought in. Yeah, so that's very complicated. And the communicating benefits part, I think companies do it, at the company level. For instance, the Nam Thuan 2 dam that you mentioned, I think the company has done a lot since its inception to communicate the benefits to the local communities that are living around there.
Yeah, the French company, they did a lot.
Yeah, they do a lot. They've actually built schools, roads, provided even healthcare, doing a lot of CSR with the communities there, and it's still ongoing. So companies will do that, but I think what we meant also by the developing a communication strategy is at all levels, so from the governmental levels all the way down to the private sector level, and it's to communicate the same message and the same story.
Yes, but maybe the gentleman at the back first. You raise your hand, right? Oh, okay. Yeah, and then maybe Jay and then Joanne after that. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, my experience with this whole area is limited, but it goes back also to Nam Thuan 2 when I was at the ADB, when I was the economist there. Actually, a lot of the social benefits from Nam Thuan 2 came from a requirement by the ADB and the World Bank that the royalties we put into a separate account and spent on education and health. So that was a requirement, and that's why we've seen it happen, I think. And that's a good lesson, I think, for future similar projects that are controversial. But on Nam Thuan 2, I remember then the power purchase agreement with Thailand specified a price, currency of that price, and I think even a quantity for a very long time period. And coming back to the first virtual question about pricing, efficient pricing, I wonder how you're going to deal with these existing contractual obligations, which basically already set the prices and sometimes even the quantities. So how do you then, deal with the efficient pricing when it's all been set very inefficiently, actually, potentially? The second point, and this is more comment, and I would like your response. For some remote and poor regions in Indochina especially, but it could apply elsewhere, the cost of connecting to a grid can be very high. Certainly, it may not make sense from a social investment point of view to bring in that connectivity, and it might make better sense to have remote, self-sufficient sources of supply like solar parks. But this needs to be in some way managed and designed, and I wonder how that is, whether that's being considered in your scheme of this whole grid expansion and connectivity, allowing for the possibility and supporting the option of very remote regions remaining off the grid because they might be better served by self-sufficient renewable sources like solar or wind, but that might require some type of subsidy as well. But instead of supporting the grid extension, it needs to also go into this alternative, which has both environmental and social benefits. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the point about ADB making these requirements is a good one. I'm sorry I missed it because clearly if left to their own devices, then some parties will not undertake the due diligence and to make sure that the environment is not damaged. And we see that also in the new project, the monsoon wind project between Laos and Vietnam, that there are these requirements to make EIAs and ensure that the communities are consulted, that any of the construction will not damage the environment. So I think that's very good, and that's because ADB is extending the support and that loan. But if it were a project that only involved private entities, and if that country does not have its own EIA requirements, then it may not, we may not see the same level of engagement and ensuring that the communities don't lose out. And the point about connecting to a grid being very high, yes, we do, throughout our fieldwork, we did encounter instances where we were told that some very, very rural communities that were near to, say, Thailand, were not communities were not able to connect to their own Lao domestic grid because the cost of building that connection for a community of, or village of, say, 50 people was it just didn't make sense. So in that case, right, the use of microgrids and ability to generate electricity using solar or using other sources, including tidal waves and so on, could be a solution. And then how then do you ensure that when the country connects and exports the electricity, then some of that benefits must flow back to those communities that will not be able ever to connect to a national grid. Yeah. Do you have anything to add, Mirza?
Okay, let's take question from Joanne. You have.
Okay.
About the pricing, the power purchase agreement pricing.
So on that, I think they just have to wait for the existing agreements to expire and then harmonize new agreements going forward. Because you can't be taking them back, before it's time. So you just have to let the passage of time pass.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Siwage and speakers. You know, when we talk about energy trade, it is usually bilateral in nature. So when you are talking about a multilateral power project, I'm just wondering what sort of criteria are you looking at? Are you looking at having a single price, a single tax rate, single maybe wheeling charges? I mean, how do you determine whether, you know, something can be considered as multilateral? So that is the first question. And the other one is about the BIMP-PIP. Is that project consisting of renewable energy, or is it just traditional energy? And when you are talking about the ASEAN Power Grid, are you only talking about renewable energy, or it can be any sort of energy? Thank you.
Okay, so in terms of a power pool, where you have many different countries, it's set up a bit differently, where you don't have like dedicated power purchase agreements between two specific countries. It's more like a pool, and then you have many different buyers and sellers. So in the case of the Nord pool, for example, you have a buyer or a seller, and they want to access the regional grid, and then they pay a transmission access charge to the transmission operator in whatever jurisdiction they're in. And then that charge can sort of vary across jurisdictions, and it's set according to the different sort of formulas or methodologies set by that jurisdiction. So it's a little bit different, and it can vary. Yeah.
So in response to your question about the LTMS-PIP, so the LTMS-PIP involves the trade of hydroelectricity produced in Laos. In terms of whether the APG only uses renewable energy, so there is a Trans-ASEAN gas pipeline project, which is, essentially looks at trade of gas. And what gets traded through the electricity grids depends on the domestic plans of individual countries. So, for example, Malaysia's latest energy transition framework focuses very heavily on gas as a transition fuel. Vietnam's Power Development Plan 8 is envisioning a complete ramp down of gas. It's looking at developing wind, particularly offshore wind. So ideally, we would trade only in electricity powered by clean sources, but that would take some time to actually materialize. Yeah.
I think we are running out of time, and but actually we still have many questions from the virtual audience. But let me just read some of them. I think from Apichai Sunchida, he refers to a recent WWF report on analyzing the high stakes of hydropower in the lower Mekong supply chain in the region, which included a fact sheet pertaining to Singapore in this regard, pointing some potential risks and pitfalls rather than just the more obvious economic benefits. So would it pose reputational risks to Singapore in the long run of branding itself as a clean and green agenda globally? So that's the first question. And the next question from Dinita Satyawati, she refers to the ASEAN Power Grid. I think the project that this project can result in a saving of about 1.8 billion US dollar. So what does this number entails, and does it include the saving against generation from fossil fuels? And then the next one, just take a notes first, and then later you can try to respond as quickly as possible. The next one from Bert Tan, he refers to Article 6.2 of Paris Agreement, which has been the focus of debate in this COP28. How can this ASEAN Grid 2.0 all projects play a role to address this challenge. And then the last one, the Singapore, this from Rohit Patel. Singapore appears to be the dominant investor in LTMS. So which country can be the main investor for BIMP-PIP? So yeah, I think maybe you can share that those questions. Mirza first, yeah.
Okay. Firstly, in response to the 1.8 billion savings, so that's from the ASEAN Energy Outlook, the 6th version, and the statistic is essentially related to the extra generation that that doesn't need to be implemented because we're sharing resources. So it's connected to savings from investments in domestic infrastructure that doesn't need to be made. So the question of Singapore, may I request Sharon to answer?
Yeah. Okay, let me explain, right? There's no investor in LTMS, okay? Because they are existing interconnections. Nobody had to actually plonk in money to build new infrastructure or anything. So using this existing connection, they actually managed to somehow come to an agreement to wheel the electricity through from Laos to Singapore. And so the question is, who will invest in the BIMP-PIP? Again, so this is a different setup where they actually expect to build new infrastructure. Now, how they are going to design all of this, who is going to invest, it will be up to the 4 countries to discuss amongst themselves, and whether they want to involve their own private sector in the endeavor. So really, if the receiving country feels that it's important enough, then perhaps they will offer to make those investments into the different interconnections. I believe there will be at least two new interconnections in the BIMP-PIP. So these discussions must take place, which is why our recommendation is that early inclusion of financial institutions, of multilateral banks in that regional, sub-regional setup would be very important, because then, the question always comes down to where's the money, and someone's got to put it up. The question on Singapore's reputation, I don't think that the question only relates to one particular country, okay? If you're going to go into an APG, then any country can be a buyer and any country can be a provider. So countries that are buyers and your private entities that are buying, or the government that is buying, for instance, will have to impose requirements on the generating country to ensure that, your environmental risks and governance risks are managed properly. And then the investors then have to be satisfied that these criteria is being met. Not unless, of course, if we do manage to somehow come together in a regional institutional arrangement, as in a regional institution actually oversees all of this, and we go into a format where, like the EU, we give a legal mandate, and someone goes in, looks at it, monitors, ensures that there is compliance, and that's a different story. So I don't think this is a question of reputational risk only to Singapore, but also it can, going into the future, it can be a reputational risk to any entity that is engaged in multilateral power trade. Yeah. Okay, the Paris Agreement, Article 6.2, presumably if we were all engaged in a regional cooperation setup, then what you would have generated using fossil, but you can import with renewable energy, would certainly go towards that country's ability, right, to meet their mitigation targets. But then we have to maybe at some point, find a way to discuss regionally amongst all the 10 or 11 countries at that point, to see who it counts towards, where all of these carbon savings count towards, which country would get to enjoy the emission reduction targets. So I can't answer Bert's question in great detail, but certainly that's why a regional institution, an establishment of that, can also help to bring these issues relating to climate mitigation into the fold, and ensure that, all of the countries who are engaging in multilateral power trade using RE can really reap all of those benefits.
Yeah, so for, participating in carbon markets through the ASEAN Power Grid, another thing that would be a huge requirement is data, clear data and transparency at quite a granular level, because you want to be really sure that what you're getting carbon credits for does lead to actual emissions reductions, and to also know the exact quantity of those reductions. So I think moving forward, transparency and reporting would be a huge requirement.
To ensure that there's no double counting. So last point, which was triggered by Jay's point, right? The point that the lesson that we heard, where the Lao communities living at the border of another country was not able to connect to a national grid. Maybe one of the things that countries could do is to allow the other countries' local communities to connect to that country, to connect to Thailand, because it's nearer to connect, and you can allow them to enjoy beneficial, equitable access to electricity if it's too far from their own national grid. Just some ideas that can come out from this.
We actually, in our research, we actually found that in some cases, villages that are located, Lao villages that are located close to the Thai border, actually connected to the Thai grid. Yeah, but there's an issue there because the prices are higher for essentially importing electricity from Thailand to Laos. So that doesn't necessarily solve the issue. So going back to your recommendation about off-grid technologies, that's definitely something that could be, economically beneficial as well as socially beneficial.
I think the price is higher before adding the cost of transmission, right? But once you add the cost of transmission, obviously it might be lower because otherwise they wouldn't be importing it. Is that right?
What we found from our research is they don't have a choice but to import. Yeah, because they're not connected to their own national grid, so there's no alternative. And this is also the case during the dry season in Laos.
Can I just add a quick observation? It's also because in Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, it's very centrally controlled. What Hanoi says, you do. What Vientiane says, you do. And what Phnom Penh says. It's very different when you get out of that and you go into democracies, and there's a lot of, time wasted. So that's the reason why they're able to do what they're able to do. But the solution to that, the provinces, is when you make the agreement, you work out an equation so that you have money coming in to create the smaller grids, whether it's floating solar or whatever it is, for these provinces that are definitely off the grid, and it's just too expensive. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we have a very good discussion today, and thank you all for your great participation and great question. And the report is available for download on our website, and please feel free to contact the team if you have any comments or inputs for this report. And I think we also would like to thank the speakers, Sharon and Mirza and Jiahui, for their excellent presentation and for this excellent report. So with that, please join me in giving the big applause to this presentation. Thank you.